Now, if you remember earlier in the lab, when we created our identity pool, our Cognito identity pool, we created a role for that to access AWS S3 and also to access AWS Sync Store as well. I'm just going to go back into the ID. So we have our user pool and we have our identity pool. So just going into the identity pool, I'm just going to click on dashboard, and I'm just going to click on edit identity pool, and I just want to have a look at that role. So you can see here that we've got an unauthenticated role attached to it. Now this role doesn't mean anything because we haven't allowed unauthenticated access to our application anyway, so that doesn't matter at all, that role. The one that we are concerned with here is the authenticated role. So I called that a big long name there. I'll just go back into the IAM console and I'll see if I can find that. So go into roles and see if I can find that one. I'll just search for Cognito. Okay, which one was it? It wasn't that one. That was it there. Okay, so that's the role that we created, and I'm just going to expand it and have a look at it. So just edit policy, have a look at the JSON there. Okay. Okay. So by default, this is the only allow that is by default with the Cognito service. So when we sign in with Cognito and we have a Cognito identity, this is a standard role that will be set up that will give you access to Cognito Sync and of course the Cognito identity pool. But what I've done here is I've also added access to S3, but that S3 access is limited to listing a bucket to that directory or that folder of that bucket. So it'll be the bucket, or my bucket is called backspace-lab-p-cody. Yours will be different, of course. They are unique. And then this Cognito user or any Cognito user will be able to list buckets, or will have permissions to list the buckets within a folder Cognito backspace academy. And then we also have an allow for get, put and delete objects, so read write access to objects, and that will be again in that bucket, and then a Cognito folder and then a subfolder called Backspace Academy. But we've also got here the Cognito ID. Okay, so the Cognito ID number or user ID for that user, there will be created a subfolder within this Backspace Academy folder as well. So they can only access a folder that is in their identity. They can't access any other folder within that bucket. And we've also got their permission to access subfolders of that Cognito identity ID bucket that they've got there. So that allows our users to sign into Cognito, into a user pool, then use those credentials or those trust relationship to then get credentials out of Cognito identity, and then use those credentials to access a subfolder in their own Cognito identity name, and only that. And that will allow them to read write access to that. So let's have a look at how that works. And back in the Atom IDE, so we need to create two functions here. So the first one that we need to create is to get our Cognito Sync token, and then once we've got our Cognito Sync token, we can pass that over to the AWS JavaScript SDK and use it to add a record to our new key store database that we've created. So again, I'm just going to copy that straight over, both of those functions over from Final, and put it into our app.js. So we can see here we've got a function for adding that record, and we've also got it a function there for getting that sync token. The first thing that we need to do is to make sure that we do actually have a logged in user. If not, then we safely exit the application. And what we need to do is that we need to create a Cognito sync object using the JavaScript SDK. Now, even though that we've created that object, we haven't done anything with it. Okay, we haven't passed any information to it, and we haven't actually even created a Cognito sync database. Now, this is something that you will not find in the AWS JavaScript documentation. Pretty crazy, I don't know, but it's not there. It doesn't tell you how to actually create the sync database. I know from experience of working with Cognito back in the early days that you need to call list records to create that Cognito sync database. So what we do is we call list records, which is normally used to obviously list the records that are in that database, but if there's no database, then it will create a database for you. So we need to give it the dataset name, which will be, we've already defined that earlier on in this code. I'll just find that here. We've already defined it as backspace-user. So our dataset or database, whatever you want to do it, key store, will be called backspace-users. And then we need to pass our identity ID for that user and the identity pool ID so that we can cross-check that identity. Once that's passed to Cognito sync list records, then we'll either get an error or else we're going to get a Cognito sync session token sent to us. And we can see here, so we're going to have our sync token and our sync count. And what we need is we need both of those to actually pass to the Cognito sync service in order to add a record. So if that's successful, we don't actually have a database before we started, but now it will automatically create that for us and pass us a token to add records. Once we've done that, we can pass that token and that sync count to this add record function. So the parameters that we need to pass to update the records or to add a record, we need that dataset name again. We need the identity ID of the user, the identity pool ID, and that sync session token that we just got previously. And we also need the sync count and the identity ID in here as well. So we don't actually have to actually have the identity as such. I've just put it in there as a value. So what I'm doing is I'm putting a record in here, and the key for that record is going to be user ID, and we're telling it to replace if there is one already there. If there isn't one there, then it's going to just create that record. And we need to pass sync count on that, which we get from which we got with our Cognito token. And then we can put a value in there. So I'm just putting in the value there of the user's identity ID. So it's going to create a record that will have, we call user ID, and the value of that user ID will be the user's identity ID. But you could create a key that says, you know, their birthday, and then the value of their birthday or whatever. It's up to you. You use it. You use your sync database however you want. It might be for top scores of a game or something. Okay, so once we've done that, then we've got that information available ready to hand over to update records. So update records is how you can actually create a record from scratch, or you can update an existing record. If that's okay, then we won't get an error. This works fine. So we'll just save that and upload that to our bucket and see how we go. And again, we make sure that we've got public access to that. And again, we make sure that we clear our browser cache, and then we can refresh. Okay, we'll sign in. Okay, I remembered my password this time. That's great. Okay, let's add a sync record to our sync database and see what happens. Okay, let's have a look and see what happened. So we've signed in successfully. We've called list records, and it's given our count of records, which is 0, and the sync count is 0. And it's also passed us our sync session token, which is in here. Okay. And here we go. We've got our sync session token and our dataset count that we're passing over to our add record. Okay, and so what we get back here is the record. So I'm just going to copy that over and see what we get back. Just have a look at a JSON editor and see what happens. Okay. Okay, so we've created, so it sends back to us what the record that has been created. So we've created a record with a key user ID, and the value is that user's Cognito identity ID. So it's done exactly what we want it to do. But again, you could create records for whatever, high score, and then the high score value for that user for a game, for example. So that's working quite well. So what we'll do now is that we'll look at using the Amazon S3 service this time with these federated credentials. Let's have a go at that.